Even before Tillerson reportedly called his boss a moron last year, the writing had been on the wall. We're going to be asking why in the France 24 debate that he's been fired, why now, how his replacement, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, will handle areas where Tillerson and Trump clashed, negotiating with the North Koreans, the Saudi-led embargo of Qatar, the Iran nuclear deal, and most recently, whether or not to blame Russia for the poisoning of a spy on British soil. What to make of the high turnover in Trump's team, by the way. Tillerson, the second major cabinet member in as many weeks to go after White House economic advisor Gary Cohn. More broadly, what will the shakeup mean for the State Department, where as of last month, 7 out of 9 top posts remain vacant, and where the president has yet to appoint ambassadors to places like South Korea, Turkey, Egypt, the European Union. What will this reshuffle mean for U.S. diplomacy? We're asking in the France 24 debate to the former State Department's former North African Affairs Director, William Jordan, who's with us here in the studio. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well for joining us from Washington, former Trump campaign advisor Walid Fares, author of The Lost Spring. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
He's a former U.S. military intelligence advisor, Michael Pregin, adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And writer and foreign policy consultant Molly McHugh is also in the U.S. Capitol.
Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The decision made last Friday, but with Rex Tillerson on a tour of the African continent, the White House waited until the tail end. The reason given by Donald Trump, well, Iran.
Rex and I have been talking about this for a long time. We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently. So we were not really thinking the same. With Mike Pompeo, we have a very similar thought process. I think it's going to go very well.
Earlier, when he made those remarks at the State Department, Rex Tillerson did not mention Iran. What did you make of what he said?
I think that Tillerson, at this point, just wants to leave with a measure of dignity and quiet, if you will. I mean, I had the impression from listening to him speak, the tone of his voice and all, that he was still a bit shaken by all of this. I mean, it can't be easy to leave the administration in this way, even though that writing has been on the wall, and a good portion of the press, right to left, has been basically calling for him to resign. So I just think that rather than, if you will, play President Trump's game and bring this up and sort of, continue to make it a big deal back and forth, prompt another Twitter storm, he just decided that he would go off, emphasizing the things where he thought he had played a useful and positive role to the U.S. policy.
Did you think he played a positive role to U.S. policy?
I think that he tried, let's put it this way, he tied his hands behind his back as he tried to do this. I think that he was a well-meaning man. He had the qualifications.
Well, that's not good if you're saying well-meaning.
Well, he's well-meaning, but I think the problem is that he right from the start made it clear that he shared to a certain extent President Trump's distrust of the foreign policy establishment in Washington, particularly in the State Department, and made it clear. And again, I think that a lot of people in the State Department didn't disagree with what he wanted to do in terms of trying to sort out some of the problems of coordination and organization in the department, but the way that he did it by taking steps before he had a chance to really get a feel for how things are done, understand why things were done the way that they were, immediately put people on the defensive, and the slowness with which he managed to fill senior positions, and you mentioned the ambassadorships in key places, just lends, that's not all his fault, but the fact that he was not able to show leadership and to push the White House to get some of these appointments made so that they could then be approved or vetted by Congress. I think all of that left him very much with his hands tied behind his back.
Walid Fares, why was he fired?
Well, Francois, for this debate, I can see two levels, and I'm trying to distinguish them from each other. One is the form, the format, the tweet, talking about it. Even as of last fall, there were rumors that he is going to be replaced. That's the Secretary Tillerson, and then the president said, not now. And then now suddenly, overnight, we have that situation. And then the content. With regard to form, what has been happening over the past year is that the procedure in appointment and vetting and removal looks more like a parliamentary republic where you have individuals who represent political parties, and then you say, well, I don't want to work with this party anymore, rather than a presidential system which we have here. We haven't seen this before under Democrats or Republican. That is going to be taken part of the discussion in the media, at least here in the U.S. What is more important, in my view, is the substance. When President Trump appointed Tillerson, it was a different situation, a different context. The opposition was not that strong yet. But then 9 months into the process, there was a stronger opposition to the policies of Mr. Trump, of President Trump, including on foreign affairs. And of course, there were a divergence of opinions between his Secretary of State and himself. My question is, why didn't this happen before? Why didn't this change of policy or of appointments didn't happen before?
And you blame Trump for that?
It's not a question of blaming. I think President Trump is advised right and left what to do, what time. The timing is not just political and foreign policy. It has to do with domestic issues, the pressures coming. But it was clear, as it was mentioned in the introduction, that on Iran there was a divergence. It was clear. On Russia, there is a divergence. On the Qatar Gulf crisis, there was a divergence. So all of that was known about June, July. And the question is, why didn't the political replacement happen before?
Michael Pregent, you're thinking of why this happened, personal chemistry or policy difference?
Well, I think North Korea accelerated the decision. Again, these talks with Kim Jong-un, it's something that President Trump wants to make sure everybody's on the same page. Now, the White House and Pompeo CIA have been on the same page on Iran, on North Korea, on ISIS, on Al-Qaeda, on these things, but they've had to convince state, and in some cases, even the Department of Defense and the National Security Council, that this was the president's position on these things. I had the opportunity to go to a Christmas party at State Department where Secretary Tillerson hinted at being much more available to the press in the coming weeks, coming months. And I think this was something that was going to happen anyway. Again, I think it was accelerated. And again, I don't like when people are being replaced and they find out about it in a tweet, or they find out about it when they're in a classroom in Africa, and then they find out they're no longer in the position. I don't like that part. Glad to see you staying on to March 31st. But what this move does, it aligns the position of the White House with the Central Intelligence Agency, and now with the Department of State. No longer do you have to convince the Department of State that the intelligence saying that Iran is this or that, or North Korea is at this stage, now with Pompeo at the head. And I think that's a good thing for U.S. foreign policy.
Really? Because the people who write those policy papers, they've been at the State Department, in some cases for decades. They're suddenly going to be sharing all the views of the boss?
Well, that's part of the problem. You have career diplomats and career bureaucrats doing these things and saying, wait a minute, President Trump, you can't just make these changes you want to make. Again, the foreign policy entity here in Washington, D.C. is saying you shouldn't meet directly with Kim Jong-un, and then others are saying this is exactly what we need to do to move the ball forward. Again, this is exactly what I think needs to happen in places where you have these entrenched figures. Again, the press in the United States says, hey, a certain person at the State Department is leaving after 30 years. Isn't that sad? No, they should be gone after 30 years, and we should have new people in there.
Molly McHugh, your reaction when you saw the news that Rex Tillerson had been fired?
I think there will be a lot of questions about the timing, particularly given some of the comments that Secretary Tillerson has made about Russia and other things in recent days, his disagreement on Korea talks and the timing of those. I think there'll be a lot of questions about that, but as the other speakers have said, it's been clear for some time there's disagreement between the White House and Secretary Tillerson on many policy issues. I think some of the issues that Michael raised.
Molly, I'm going to have to
really
interrupt you, unfortunately, because we're having sound issues with the Skype connection. We're going to try to call you right back and hopefully get a better connection. Apologies for that. William Jordan, the question we've been asking is, again, these unfilled posts. Mm-hmm. Is that a deliberate strategy, or is that simply that, well, there's a lot of improvisation, both on the part of Tillerson and the White House?
Well, I think the problem, as I understand it, I mean, is that, and part of this is, I'm sure everybody else on this panel are going to have some other views on this, depending on their political take. But I mean, for a long time, there's been this narrative coming out of the White House, in particular, and to some extent, the people around Tillerson saying, "Oh, we're having trouble with the Democrats. We're having trouble getting these people confirmed." But if you look at the folks who are lined up for these positions, in other words, the people who've actually gone through the vetting process and therefore have gotten the okay from the White House to be nominated and sent up to Capitol Hill, that's where I see the problem. Now, some folks have said that this has a lot to do with the problems that Trump has had from day one with the no-Trumpers in the Republican foreign policy establishment, that the White House essentially created a blacklist of people who would normally have been brought into a Republican administration, but because they didn't want Trump during the campaign, they have effectively been told, no, we don't want your services at all. So the Trump folks have been forced to go out for those positions that would always
harder to find candidates.
Harder to find candidates for the positions that are always filled by political appointees. As far as the ambassadorships that could and often are filled by career diplomats and the senior positions in the State Department at the level of Assistant Secretary of State, for example, which is a secondary level of management in the department, I think that's been a problem where the White House and the State Department have been fighting back and forth over the degree to which Rex Tillerson would actually be able to take the lead in coming up with these names. And he has talked several times publicly about problems with some of the nominations that the White House has tried to impose upon him.
So they didn't agree on names,
versa.
so no one was named.
Exactly. And so
Wally Fares, your thoughts. His last tour as Secretary of State, he goes off to Africa without there being a Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Who do you blame for that?
Look, the whole issue of why were not many positions filled or people appointed, I agree with the general view that this is unusual. Between Clinton and Bush, the Bush appointees went through, of course there are hearings, and of course sometimes you have criticism by the opposing party. It happened between Clinton and Bush, between Bush and Obama. Now, when the Trump administration came in, we need to analyze really, is the criticism against the nominees is one of technical matters that do not fit, or is there a real opposition, real political opposition? I think it's legitimate to have an opposition. I think the Democratic Party in the Senate, if they want to oppose and get something in return, it's fine. The only concern if there is an opposition within the bureaucratic body inside the State Department, meaning if they are the ones basically not advising the Secretary of State for change and they are the ones who are opposing these nominations. That would be the bigger question in my view.
Last week, the BBC reporting on leaked emails by a Trump donor and the lobbyist close to the Emiratis, Elliot Broidy, urging that Tillerson be fired. The UAE, the rival of Qatar, where the United States has a military base. The emails state that Tillerson was performing poorly and should be fired at a politically convenient time. Wally Fares, did the Saudis and the Emiratis make the push to get Tillerson out?
Who knows? I mean, we had that email in a newspaper. We didn't hear anything from official sides so far. But that wouldn't surprise me that international parties would be satisfied or non-satisfied with the U.S. Secretary of State. It's not the first time. We heard it from Europeans about certain secretaries of state. We heard it from Africans, Middle Eastern, of course, from Russia, but that's not the issue right now. It is possible that there would be opinion by international parties, but I think that the decision to replace a Secretary of State is much wider than just listening to what an international party would like to see happening within our own government.
Molly McHugh, your thoughts on this?
I think that we're seeing a return to President Trump's campaign agenda domestically and in terms of foreign policy. And I think there will be differing views and differing comfort levels with that agenda from within the Washington. You can call it establishment if you'd like. You can call it the crazy deep state if you'd like. But there's a reason that these views have formed over time. And I think the wholesale rejection of the idea that the diplomatic corps of the United States of America has knowledge that can apply to these challenges is a little bit ridiculous. Certainly, there's always a need to change up thinking and bring in fresh views. But I think the real legacy of Rex Tillerson will be remembered as the gutting of the State Department. And the rebuilding of that will now fall to potentially next Secretary Pompeo. And this is going into a range of challenges where President Trump is making it very clear he intends to refocus, making a deal with North Korea, making a new deal with Iran, potentially making a deal with Russia, while we have fraught relationships with most of our traditional allies. I think this is a very challenging period for American foreign policy.
You agree with that, Michael Pregent?
Well, I think that there are challenges, but again, when an obstacle is your presidential appointed Secretary of State, and you're not on the same page when it comes to Iran, you're not on the same page when it comes to North Korea, I think these changes have to be made. And again, a lot of these changes were in the works back in December of 2017. So I think we shouldn't be surprised by this. But one of the things I am seeing in other places, as we talk about these gaps that need to be filled, these positions in the State Department, also the Department of Defense, and also within the National Security Council, is that the president has been focused on laterally moving people in from government, meaning they already have existing salaries, and they just become somebody who transitions into the Department of State. So we're not seeing civilian expert hires. And I think that's where, where your other panelists have talked about the talent that's out there, the never Trump people that aren't going to get in. I think the president needs to change that strategy and start bringing in civilian experts, because in the National Security Council, you literally have a military chain of command that's immovable because they all answer to a 3-star general and they're afraid to push back.
Yeah, and Mike Pompeo, we're going to talk about him now, a former Kansas congressman who graduated top of his class at West Point to replace Tillerson. Aaron Agunke has been taking a look.
He is said to be one of Donald Trump's favorites. Now, after 14 months as CIA director, Mike Pompeo is set to replace Rex Tillerson as top diplomat of the United States. And unlike his predecessor, he is known for his political alignment with the president.
I've worked with Mike Pompeo now for quite some time. Tremendous energy, tremendous intellect. We're always on the same wavelength. The relationship has been very good, and that's what I need as Secretary of State.
Mike Pompeo attended the prestigious military academy West Point and served in the Army for 5 years. He was elected to the House of Representatives as a Tea Party Republican in 2010. He solidified his reputation as a staunch conservative when he served on the House Select Benghazi Committee, the special panel that investigated the 2012 killing of a U.S. ambassador and 3 other Americans in Benghazi. He became a leading voice against Hillary Clinton, which reportedly contributed to Donald Trump's decision to name him CIA director. Pompeo was one of the most politicized directors of the American intelligence agency. He opposed Barack Obama's plan to close Guantanamo Bay and defended the CIA's use of torture under George W. Bush. And while he has publicly supported last year's intelligence report concluding that Russia meddled in the 2016 presidential election, he has often downplayed the extent of the Kremlin's influence. Perhaps most importantly, Mike Pompeo echoes President Trump's hardline stances on Iran and North Korea.
We're going to work hard to make sure that we get what it is the president has set out very clearly for his entire time in office, which is the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea.
The U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee will hold a hearing in April to consider Pompeo's nomination.
Wally Fares, you heard Michael Pregent worry about a militarization of the cabinet. Is there going to be too much one kind of thinking inside of Trump's team?
Well, let's be clear. The secretaries of these departments should be in line with the president's position. As I said earlier, we're not talking about a coalition government here. This is a presidential cabinet. The opposition can come from Congress, from the media, and elsewhere to argue, so they should be in line. Now, I agree with him with regard the diversity of opinion, with regard the fresh blood, let's say, into the White House and the National Security Council of experts from the civilian side, in addition to the military side. On that one, I agree. There need to be a much higher diversity.
Molly McHugh, your thoughts on the nomination by Trump of Mike Pompeo's deputy to replace him at the CIA, Gina Haspel, a Black Ops veteran who once ran a secret interrogation operation in Thailand and is accused of torturing detainees?
Well, the reaction from inside the intelligence community has been relatively positive because of her service career and her expertise, particularly on covert and clandestine operations. She certainly seems to be a respected professional within the intelligence community, and I think that's really important. There was a lot of uncertainty about some of the names that had been previously floated to potentially replace Director Pompeo if he were to be moved to the State Department. So I think in terms of the CIA itself, this choice will reassure the internal structures. I think she'll have to have some conversations with the Hill about some of the more political aspects of her past service record, including enhanced interrogation and other things. But I think that she has previously answered those and done fairly well, so she'll probably be all right.
Tillerson's last disagreement, by the way, was over Russia. He pointed the finger at Moscow over the poisoning of Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, England. Ahead of the curve, the White House yet to condemn. The White House where they're not condemning yet, but as the president often says, stay tuned.
Speaking to Theresa May today, it sounds to me like it would be Russia based on all of the evidence they have. I don't know if they've come to a conclusion, but she's calling me today. As you know, now we're going to the wall. We're going out to the wall, but Theresa May is going to be speaking to me today. It sounds to me like they believe it was Russia, and I would certainly take that finding as fact.
Molly McHugh, how do you expect Mike Pompeo to handle Russia?
It's a good question in terms of what potential measures are we willing to take to counteract increasingly aggressive steps from Russia against the West, against NATO, against the United States. Thus far, the response tactics have not been very clearly outlined. Are we willing to go further in terms of financial assets and other seizures? Are we willing to impose further personal sanctions against Putin and his inner circle? Are we willing to look at things that probably hit a little harder at the Kremlin and its sense of pride, like boycotting the World Cup, naming names in terms of exposing more information about Putin and corruption in his inner circle? And I just think there hasn't been that level of creativity thus far in terms of responding to Russia. There are in fact, many things underway underneath the surface of the White House, particularly initiatives led from DOD and by Secretary Mattis and within our military that are standing up new capabilities and capacity across the Russian frontier within Europe, sort of new force measures being taken. But we need a policy that backs that it really engages more diplomatic capacity behind finding new solutions with Russia, where they're making it clear they don't abide by the rules that the international community wants to impose on them. They're conducting assassinations. They are conducting what we would term active measures across the West and amongst our allies. And thus far, they've paid very little price for all of that, and they know it. And as long as that remains the case, they will continue to move forward with this kind of shadow warfare that has been very successful for Putin.
Michael Pregent, with Donald Trump fending off accusations that Russia helped get him elected, how much do you expect him to back Britain in its current standoff with Russia?
I think the president's looking for something concrete, like what's going to be presented to him by the British authorities. I think if he gets something concrete that shows that this was a high-level Russian decision to conduct a political assassination against a Russian in Britain, I think the president will do something about that. I don't see him trying to downplay this. I think he's looking for something like this where he can say, listen, I'm going to be strong on Russia. And what I would say about Pompeo is Pompeo is strong on Russia. He is strong on Iran. He is strong on entities. And I think Pompeo has a different strategy with regards to Syria, with what the Russians and the Iranians are doing to punish civilians in eastern Ghouta and in Syria at large. So I think we're going to see a change, not only as Molly suggested, and that the focus is right on the diplomatic and on whatever economic levers we can use against Russia, but on what we can do to hurt Russia, the Russian campaign in Syria, and also continue to send lethal aid to the opposition in Ukraine.
I don't know, William Jordan. Sometimes when Trump speaks about Russia, his statements can sound a little ambiguous.
Perhaps, but I agree with what's been said that Pompeo, especially with whatever new mandate that Trump is going to give him to, if you will, impose a certain rigor and discipline within the State Department that hasn't been there under Tillerson, which I have to agree has largely been the case. And indeed, I think that one of the first things that Pompeo will do is exactly what he did to restore a measure of morale, which was initially crushed when the transition from the Obama to the Trump administrations took place. He will make sure that these appointments that Tillerson has not been able to make get made. I expect that to be the first thing. So there will be immediately, in my view, a message, a very clear message, that there's a new management at the State Department. It is much more in accord with what the White House is trying to do. And then I think that he will start to articulate perhaps a clearer policy on the way to go forward with Russia, for example, and in all of these other areas. I suspect that Trump will probably initially give him a certain room for maneuver in that to see how it plays out. One of the things that Pompeo is going to have to do as well is he's going to have to deal with the competing power center as far as national security policy for this U.S. is concerned in New York, with Nikki Haley and some of the statements that she's recently said about Russia. I think she right now, especially on Syria, is charting the course for a harder line for the United States. With what's happened in the UK, with this poisoning incident, with what needs to be sort of considered taking the very personal, ego-driven part of the investigations into possible collusion over the 2016 campaign off the table. These are the kinds of things that President Trump needs to be focused on, because these are what define American interests. I think Pompeo is the person who will probably be able to talk to Trump and to get him to think more along those lines and to be less ambiguous.
Mike Pompeo was a cadet at West Point in 1983 when there was the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. And would you say that that's something, when it comes to the Iran dossier, that could cloud his vision? There's a lot of people in the high echelons at the Pentagon who remember those days. And does that, when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, make it a vendetta?
I don't. The thing for me is that Pompeo does not have a clouded vision. I think that he's going to be taking over an organization that is going to have experts and other people who will say that there are shades of gray here, there are nuances here that you have to take into account. These memories that you've talked about, that Pompeo will be coming from, will be there, and Pompeo will have them. Pompeo will come into the job no differently than any other Secretary of State has in the past. He will have, as will the other political leaders in Washington, the right and the ability to be able to ignore the experts and the nuance speakers in order to try to evoke and announce a more straightforward and clear-cut policy.
Right, but Walid Fares, when you hear, as we heard at the outset of this program, Donald Trump saying that him and Pompeo see eye to eye when it comes to Iran, does that mean, well, ripping up the Iran nuclear deal?
Not that fast, not that way. Let me just go back 1 inch in time and talk about the Russia link to Iran and see how the next Secretary of State will be dealing with this issue. Obviously, when the evidence about what Russia allegedly has done in Great Britain will come to the White House, there should be, not just there would be, but there should be a clear position by President Trump. Now, what is ironic is that those who are criticizing the president on Russia are completely ignoring the fact that they were the ones who supported the Iran deal. Now, what is the Iran deal? It's sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Russia to buy anti-aircraft weapons, to buy missiles, to buy technology. The Iran deal is also funding these militias, which are protected by Russia in Syria and Iraq. So if there need to be a change to push back against Russia, as one of the commentators has mentioned, first thing to do is to push back against their allies, the Assad regime, Hezbollah, and the Iranian regime, which is a matter that Pompeo has very clear, not just now, but years ago in hearings he had been part of.
And what does that mean when it comes to Syria as well, Walid Fares?
Well, the first thing comes to our mind, let's go straight to the point. Iran has been able, after the weakening of ISIS, to establish a highway from Iran to Iraq and Syria to Hezbollah and Lebanon. We in the United States are in a position to cut down that highway. That's a very practical matter, not just to make statements about Eastern Ghouta, because we have no way to get to Eastern Ghouta, but we have a way to cut down that highway in Eastern Syria. This is a very practical point, and Pompeo himself spoke about it.
On that score, Michael Pregent, resisting the influence of Iran in Syria, is it also about what policy will it be going forward when it comes to how you handle both sides of this equation, both regional rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia?
Right. I mean, if you look at what we're trying to do in Iraq, we're trying to inject Sunni regional interest in Iraq through economic investment, through economic levers in order to counter what Iran is doing. But like Walid said, that Iran land bridge actually composes Iraq, and there's a lot we can do there. And the Iraqi government just brought in Revolutionary Guard Corps militias into its army, into its actual military, where we're providing equipment and funds. So that's a U.S. lever that we can put pressure on Iran right there, and also Baghdad to back away. So as you look at what we're trying to get Saudi to do in Syria, what we're trying to get Saudi to do in Iraq, it's all contingent on curbing what Iran is doing in both places. So just like Walid said, just like William said and Molly said, there are a lot of things we can do at the diplomatic and at the economic, with our levers in the economic realm, but we have to acknowledge the presence of Iran. Again, Russia can't stay in Syria without Iran. We can hurt Russia by hurting Iran. And May 12th, this Iran deal, if you want to influence the president, you don't do it through Madison McMaster. You do it through Senator Tom Cotton, and you do it through Pompeo. And both are adamantly against the JCPOA. And it's my gut feeling that we'll likely walk away May 12th.
Likely walk away. We're going to leave it there. Unfortunately, so many more questions to ask. I want to thank Michael Pregent, Walid Fares, Molly McHugh, William Jordan. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So, obviously, lots of buzz, lots of reactions. Some of them serious, some of them analytical, others mocking about this latest departure. Yes, believe it or not. We have the Huffington Post, French edition. Lots of wordplay on Rex as well. Surexposé, overexposed. In any case, he's going to be underexposed from now on, I suppose. Just remember, the White House is not in chaos, and the hashtag du jour, Rexit. I think if I see another exit hashtag, I might have to take early retirement or something. Meanwhile, meanwhile, Le Monde using that image of a washing machine, or I suppose what would you say, kind of something that's spinning fast and having water or whatever else exit. And they're not the only ones. Lots of images of washing machines as well, or lessiveuses. President Trump would like you to know that even though he's fired Tillerson to replace, etc., his administration is running like a fine tuned, well-oiled machine. So you can see there are lots of people sort of being mocking as I announced. Obviously, also a lot of analysis of what the background to this may have been, what the different points of discord may have been. This was on the 5th of March actually, that this came out via the BBC, but it was picked up by Middle East Eye and others, that apparently the United Arab Emirates was lobbying the US to sack Tillerson for backing Qatar. There are also, the Iran deal is getting a certain amount of mention as well.
Saudi Arabia, UAE's influence outsized with this administration? Absolutely. I mean, I think that what Walid Farah said about this is absolutely true. I mean, this is probably taking place, and it's very serious.
Mm-hmm. Now, others sort of taking a step back. This is in Politico.com. There's a new Secretary of State who cares. Now, it's a flippant headline, but what they're saying here is, as we sort of move towards a world that is transitioning to multipolarity, perhaps the old maxim that if American leadership wobbles, so too does the world, it's just not the case anymore, that things are changing at such a sort of a rapid pace, and that there's this multipolarity coming in, and something that might have been, that would have had a big ripple effect in the past, perhaps does not anymore. Sorry, Washington, the world doesn't need you anymore. So I think there's a fair degree of tongue-in-cheek in the tone there, and the analysis is a little bit more balanced and nuanced, but certainly it's an attention-grabbing headline. The Trump supporters on social media saying that he had to go, at least some of them are saying that he was in disagreement on various things, such as the Paris Accord, the Iran deal, etc. Ian Bremmer, political analyst, saying Tillerson had zero interest in building morale at the State Department, but he was an important voice of sanity on Gulf states, Lebanon, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, and there will be fewer people keeping Trump from doing stupid and reckless things on the global stage. That's Ian Bremmer's point of view.
Last year, the Washington Post had reported that there was this suicide pact between Rex Tillerson, Mattis, the defense secretary, and the Treasury Secretary, Mnuchin. Do you believe that, or does that seem plausible to you?
No, that doesn't seem plausible to me. No.
Well, lots of comment in any case across the board on this. Trump confirms a lot of intrigue as well about the manner in which this was done and the degree of communication or lack thereof. Trump confirms he did not consult his Secretary of State on the decision to talk to North Korea. No, I really didn't discuss it very much with him. And we're also seeing this rather odd statement from Rex Tillerson's spokesman that's been kind of going around on social media as well, which is pretty remarkable. And it says that he wanted to stay in his job, was unaware of the reason for his firing, and had not spoken to Trump about it. So,
and that man's now been fired.
Right.
So his firing has been announced by the White House.
Right.
He's the Undersecretary for Political Diplomacy, or Public Diplomacy.
And Tillerson, it was noted as well by many who looked at his press conference that he did not thank Trump for appointing him or praise Trump's leadership in a statement just now. So it looks like there's a degree of a bad blood between the two men. I'll finish with a few cartoons because really sometimes a picture does speak 1,000 words. Tillerson, this is the New Yorker, I believe. Tillerson forgot to wear his TV frame. It lets you hold the president's attention for a few extra seconds before he wants to change channels. 5 stages of White House employment. So lots of people obviously picking up on the whole apprentice sort of image of firing, whatnot. I'm sure that has been carefully considered as well. That's right, Brexit. And this is the Daily Show, again, the celebrity president, who will be the next to go. So I think a lot of people mocking, but perhaps concerned as well, and that weird mix of feelings that tends to emerge when something like this happens.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.